Who owns Mars? It's a surprisingly big problem. With the USA and China planning to send humans by the 2030s, and with private company SpaceX potentially sending them by 2026, it's gonna get pretty crowded up there. You can even go online and buy a bit of Mars yourself. I've got mine. So who owns what up there? And what happens if things get nasty? I think we're gonna need a space lawyer.
It's time to explore the unexplored.
Space law sounds like a fantasy job, but it does kind of make sense. Surely there must be some kind of rules and regulations. Well, yes, and it started in 1957. The US and the Soviets are in the midst of a Cold War. They're sworn ideological enemies. Suddenly, the Soviets launch Sputnik, the first ever human activity in outer space. It flies around the Earth a few times, including directly over the US. And that raised a whole bunch of new questions. If an enemy vehicle enters your airspace, then you can shoot it down. But suddenly people had to think about, where does airspace end and space begin? The prospect of war in space was so frightening, they decided to keep the war on terra firma. To the surprise of the rest of the world, they joined together and drafted the Outer Space Treaty. Finally, it's over to the space lawyer.
The most fundamental baseline principle is found in Articles 1 and 2 combined, which basically makes outer space into a kind of a global commons, an international area, legally very similar to the high seas, and no single state can act as if outer space or part of the outer space or even part of the moon is part of the national territory. It's basically open for all states, and freedom for states to be active there is the bottom line. The drafters of the Outer Space Treaty were basically concerned with two elements, if you will. One was the military use of outer space, and then a secondary subsidiary level about science. The treaty didn't really discuss things which we are confronted with today as questions, at least theoretically, like the settlement on the moon or human settlements on Mars.
So it's good that states are free to use space, even if they weren't thinking about settlement. But that wasn't the only thing they weren't thinking about in 1957. The treaty only refers to political states. It doesn't even mention private companies. So does that mean that the billionaires of the world are exempt from the treaty?
One of the clear drawbacks looking back at the Outer Space Treaty was the absence of any detailed reference to the private sector. So what you see in the Outer Space Treaty is only one almost fleeting reference to the private sector in the guise of what they call non-governmental entities. But at the same time, it made sure that the state, in this case the United States or any other state, where those activities belonged to, was the one being responsible. And then Article 7 followed that up with also liability. So not only you as the United States will be responsible for them, for whatever they do, and you will be liable for any damage they cause by doing that. So the United States cannot dodge any international responsibility just because SpaceX or Virgin Galactic or Blue Origin does something in outer space.
Okay, so I get that ultimately states are responsible for what private entities do in space, how they operate, and any damages. But what about the use of land on Mars? We're planning on building habitats and living on Mars. Is that even allowed?
So we have to make a very fundamental and important distinction between, on the one hand, the prohibition for any state to own part of Mars. On the other hand, the freedom of outer space activity, which is the other part of the global commons thing, also means the freedom of simply establishing a habitat, putting space objects there, which then serve as houses, or probably even excavate minerals locally and build a habitat from those minerals. That all is in principle, again, allowed. And of course, there is a tension between those two, because it is one thing to be allowed to land somewhere, to put people down somewhere, maybe to have them live there for 25 or 30 years. But at what point in time should we say, wait a minute, now we are moving to something which looks too much like a real colony, which is prohibited by the Outer Space Treaty. But again, that question has not been solved yet.
But it's not like here on Earth, where if you break a treaty, we can physically take action. Mars is over 300 million kilometers away. So if the USA or Russia or China or a private company starts breaking the rules up there, wouldn't it be pretty hard to stop them?
Next question is then, of course, what happens if a private entity disregards the international rules of space law? Well, if that happens, then of course the first line is that the operator who goes beyond the terms of the license will be held criminally liable under the laws of his own country. It becomes a little bit more complicated at the second level when we go to the international arena. Either these states have to agree to a tribunal, or they have to sort things out on a diplomatic level. And of course, then the reality of the international community kicks in, that the bigger you are as a state, the more you might get away with.
These are all crazy scenarios that could arise in the future. And talking of the future, many people see Mars as a future second home for humanity. But how would our laws on Earth work in space? And if no country is allowed to claim sovereignty over celestial bodies, then how will it be governed if there are communities and multiple generations of Martian people?
But of course, at some point in time, certainly when they start living there, knowing that they will never return to Earth, when they probably get babies there who have never been on Earth for any part of their life, there will be a tendency for those quote-unquote colonies, I prefer to use the word settlements actually, to say, well, we don't want to be ruled by this earthbound state anymore, because they have no idea what it means to live on Mars and to be safe on Mars. So we want to create our own legal regime, and sooner or later that may actually become, we want to create our own state. I often compare this with the Pilgrim Fathers who went to North America, and then after a number of years said, well, why are we still paying taxes to the British King in faraway London? So it took a war of independence before the United Kingdom finally accepted, okay, let them be on themselves, let them be their own state. I just hope that when that happens in space, we are more peaceful as terrestrial states in allowing those to go out on their own. But that's still decades away, if not much further.
If my first chat with a space lawyer has taught me anything, it is that there is still a lot of grey area in space law. If we want humans to play nice on Mars, then we're going to have to answer a lot of these unresolved questions. And if you're silly enough to have fallen for one of those bogus websites that claims that you can buy a piece of land on Mars, well,
the paper is just worth the paper it's written on, and it doesn't give you any title. Don't expect to reap any benefits from it.